Hey everyone, welcome back to another video of code at GWA. So today we'll be going over Module 3, and in particular we'll be going over user-defined functions, so how to return values from them, how to initialize them, and what arguments and parameters are. We'll also be going over that concept of linearity, or sequences, that I mentioned in Module 1. So let's get started. Functions, like I said before in Module 1, they're the main foundation, the main building block in Python. They take inputs and they manipulate them and interact with them somehow to produce an output. So Python has many inbuilt functions, and print being one of them. But you can also make user-defined functions. So if there are chunks of code that you use quite frequently throughout your code, it's more efficient in terms of time and computation power just to make a user-defined function, so that you can just continue to call this function rather than write out like 10 lines of code every time you need to do that particular task. Arguments are pretty much your inputs. So in the case of print, if you do print hello world, then the argument would be hello world. And you don't need an argument in some occasions, but some functions will require an argument, like type. Parameters they're essentially what the function expects as an input. So print, it can expect a single input, so it can expect just hello world, or it could expect two strings, hello world, as you see here, and I am a string, that you can read this. And it will continue to expect more, but you don't need to print more. And yeah, like I said before, functions don't need to have inputs. Sometimes they'll just print nothing. So for an example of functions and I guess parameters and arguments are here. So the function is obviously print. Your arguments are hello world, the string hello world, and the string here. And your parameter is, well, print is, like I said, flexible. So it expects really anything. You've defined or initialized an integer as someone's age, and you've defined a string as someone's name. And this shows that print can take variables as arguments, and the data type of the arguments don't matter because it can print anyway. Since there are no arguments in the third print, it won't print anything. So if there's no argument in a function, then if there's no local variables, which I'll mention later, then it won't print anything unless it has some, like I said, any calculations involved that don't require arguments. So let's make our own function. And how do you do that? So first let's go over the syntax. As you see here, def is the statement required to initialize a function, and anything after this will be the name of the function. So in a way it's very similar to initializing a variable, except you don't need to put an equal sign, and you actually have, this would be your statement to initialize the function. So in this case, some function is the name of it, and your expected, or your parameter, would be an input. So this function is expecting one input, one argument I should say. One thing to note is that the names of the functions that you make, they're like variables. You can have any characters in them, but you can't have spaces, and you can't have numbers at the start of them. And when you write this out, when you write the statement out, you always have to have a colon after the name of your function. And remember to always put brackets here. So yeah, as you see here, if you combine all of this, you're initializing the function called some function. You're expecting one argument called an input. And if you want to reference this input anytime in this function, then you'd write out an input. And of course you need a colon here. And after you've written this line, you need to press space. And in most environments, it will automatically make an indent, but in some it may not. So if the latter is the case, then you need to press tab to make an indent. Otherwise, you'll have a syntax error. So let's go over some examples. So you're defining a function called sayHi. As you see here, it will print hello there and goodbye. It doesn't have any arguments, as you can see here, so you don't need to give anything. And if you call it, then it should print hello there, goodbye. And we're defining another function called 33, so this should print 33. And now we're going to see what these do. So as expected, when we called say hi and 33, it printed these things. So as you can see here, there's a print function sandwiched in between say hi and 33. And this is to add the space between goodbye and 33. All print functions, after they print their argument, they have this hidden /n. So when they're called, they'll print the argument and then they'll make a new line after they're called. But to save you from using this function, you can just delete that, edit this function a little bit, and use that technique Suraj showed last time in module 2, and this should have the same effect. So as you can see here, it has the same effect and you don't need to put print. And once you've finished defining your function, remove the indent by just deleting space. So tab and then delete. So now that you've seen a few examples of defining your own function, let's try to do task 1. Okay, so as you see here, we'll define yellet, and we've initialized a local variable. So I talked about this before, but a local variable is a variable that only exists within a certain indent. We haven't gone over for and while loops yet, but just know that if you see an indent, you can kind of consider this to be a plane of existence of sorts. So if I were to define, since I define a phrase here, and I try to print phrase here, it would not do anything. It would actually return an error message. But I'll show you that later, but let's just try to run the function now. So as you see here, we use the .upper function to make the string in uppercase, and we use concatenation with the string addition in order to add the exclamation mark. Just to show you the concept of local variables, I'm going to try to use print here. As you see here, because phrase was initialized within this function, it's considered a local variable and is therefore not recognized outside of this indentation. So if you were to define a function within a function, let's say SDF, it takes no arguments, and you made an indent again, and you made a variable in this, anything within this indent line will not recognize the variable initialized here. But just note that this phrase is still considered to be a local variable. Yeah. So yeah, let's interact with this. What do I want to yell? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. There you go. It has the same effect as what we did before, but this time it's more interactive. So as I mentioned earlier, print is very flexible in terms of its arguments. It can take pretty much anything. Type is a little more restrictive. Its parameter is just a single Python object. You can't separate it. You can't have multiple inputs. It can only be one thing. And you have to put something in there, unlike print. If you call type with no input or argument, then it will return an error message. And again, your parameters are defined when you define the function. So for as an example of this concept, we'll go over task 1 again. This time, instead of defining the local variable within the parameter itself, we're going to be doing it through the inputted argument. So as you see here, its parameter is just the variable phrase, and since this is considered to be the local variable, it's referred to again here. So again, if you change this to something like chat, then you'd have to change this to chat. The same concept is used here. So initializing your argument within the parameter itself. So this task is more to test your understanding of what arguments and parameters are. But it is essentially just a replica of task 1. So as you see here, it has the same output as task 1. So the return statement is very easy to use. Once you've performed an operation on the variable that you want to manipulate, just type in return, and then whatever the name of that variable that you've manipulated is. So let's see some examples of this. When we run this, we'll define message double, and it has a parameter of 1 argument, and the argument is called phrase. We've defined another local variable called double, and it's manipulating phrase by concatenating it with itself and adding a space in between. So because it has return here, it will return a string the string being your argument, space your argument. And in this specific case, your argument will be initialized as let's go. So this should be let's go, let's go. So when you call this, it will return let's go, let's go. And you can now initialize a variable as this because it's returning an object. It's not performing a function. Instead of saving this as a variable, this is just to show you that you can do this, you can print whatever's returned. So knowing all this, we can try to do task 3 now. Okay, so hopefully you've done task 3. The parameter is named name. The argument, I have made this input here, whatever the input is here. And it should return Dr. whatever your name is, Dr. Zero. So you can make something akin to the print statement, where you can take multiple parameters. You just have to separate them with commas. So an example of that would be make schedule. So here your parameters are period 1 and period 2, and they're distinguished by the comma in between them. So as you can see here, this function will return the local variable schedule. So as you can see here, this function will return the variable schedule. So this should return schedule first mathematics with capital M, and second history with capital H. And obviously you can see that student schedule has been defined as schedule. Yep, so as predicted, it does that. So let's try to do task 4 now. So this is a very simple task. Just pretty much add an extra parameter, and then add that into this initialization here, and then add your extra argument, and bam, you have got an extra subject in your schedule. But let's do the extension task. So as you see here, the extension task is also quite easy. I've just condensed it a lot. You can remove a lot of fluff to make it look like this. Just keep in mind that this can be made even more efficient. Now it's not the best having a string this long, but once we get into for and while loops, you'll know how to make this a lot better. So I mentioned in module 1 that Python is a linear language, so I'm just going to go over it again quickly. So again, if I define hat available after I call it, then it'll obviously return an error message. As you see here, name error, because you haven't defined it yet, so technically it's not recognized as a function, and that's technically a name error. So we'll see an example of that. We'll run the code, and as you see here, same code up here. It's a name error because we haven't defined hat available before we call it. So knowing this, try to fix the code. Okay, so this is fairly simple. All you have to do is just move these after it's been defined. So one thing to note when you're coding is try to avoid hard coding. Hard coding is when you make an argument a constant, pretty much. So as you see here, this will always be green, no matter what. And this kind of defeats the purpose of a function in a lot of ways. It just makes it a lot less flexible. So whenever you call it, it will always have some limitation because you're always restricted to your argument here. However, if this is a variable, you can always change it if you need to change it in your code. So just try to avoid it. Okay, so we've pretty much gone through all the content that we need to know about functions. So now that we know all this, we can try to do all the tasks that remain. Okay, let's do task 6. You can make this a lot more condensed by removing this step. You can just put bird available in this print function here. You could put the input in your parameter instead, so you move another line, and then you can just connect it to 4 lines. So here I've defined the function. I've made the list of birds that are available in a string. The input is here, and if the desired bird is in this list, it will return true, but if it's not, it will return false, and then it will print it is true or false that we have whatever your desired bird was. So I want a parrot, let's say. But let's say I want a raven. Oh, we don't have Raven. That's unfortunate. Um, this does not account for uppercase, lowercase, so you might want to do an upper or lower situation to ensure that it's not case sensitive, but you don't have to. So in task 7, it might be a little tricky to spot the error at first, but always try running it. And you'll see this in invalid syntax on line 2. So that's very helpful, allows you to pinpoint what exactly is wrong. So hopefully you'll be able to notice that that the def part of it is missing. And you can just run this now on 3. Now let's try to do a 2-part task. So part 1's quite easy. And see, it automatically titles it. And just a note about when you do local and global variables, try to name them different things. Like, if you don't want to do this and want to make it as a separate thing, like title equals input and so on, I would just recommend naming it something else, because although this doesn't affect this, it does make it really confusing when you want to reference it further down the line. So part 2 in this is essentially using this and adding it into a larger operation. In this case, you have 2 arguments and you're concatenating them. And you can notice here that we're using the previous function as an argument for this function, because this returns an object, so therefore can be used since the argument is an object. And we just have to call it, and when doing this, you can't use commas because it will kind of separate them into separate strings. So with the final task, try to find the error here. Okay, hopefully you found it, but it has to do with the sequence of the code. So if you run it, it should give you a name error because you haven't defined the functions, as you see here. So thanks for watching another video. Stay tuned for module 4. In that one, we'll be going over conditionals. If you have any questions, please feel free to let us know. And as always, check the overview if you want to see future lessons. And yeah, thanks for watching.